Yeah.
Okay, fine.
I think we should start now.
Okay.
A very good afternoon, all of you. We are very happy to start the ICMLS webinar series, which is going to start from today, and it will be lasting for another 15 days, having different areas of medical laboratory professionals. And today we do have with us Dr. C.P. Pandey, who is a Principal Technical Officer from CSIR CDR Institute, Lucknow. Uh, he is going to moderate the session. I'm going to hand over the platform to Dr. C.P. Pandey now. Dr. Pandey, sir.
This is Chandra Prakash Pandey from Division of Pharmacology, CSIR Central Drug Research Institute. We are into first of the webinar series, Indian Confederation of Medical Laboratory Sciences. As you are aware, the world is passing through a crisis which is known as novel coronavirus disease. And before we go on to that, today happens to be the National Technology Day, the day on which India became nuclear power by making nuclear tests at Pokhran on 11th of May 1998 under the auspices of our Honorable Prime Minister, late Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So kudos to all the scientists and technologists and engineers who are making their serious efforts to develop and help the society a better place to live. So as you are aware, on the screen we find the topic COVID-19 epidemiology, pathophysiology and management. This is going to be presented by one of our learned speaker, Professor Vinita Agrawal. She is professor at the Department of Pathology, Sanjay Gandhi Postgraduate Institute of Medical Sciences. She has done her graduation and masters from Department of Pathology, King George's Medical University, Lucknow. So as of now, like things are settled. So I would invite Madam to go ahead with the presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra Prakash, for the kind invitation and also for the kind introduction. First of all, let me congratulate the scientific fraternity for their contributions to the science and all their achievements, which has helped in the advancement of science. Coming on to COVID-19, I'll be talking about epidemiology, pathophysiology, and management of COVID-19. It is not just a global health crisis, but it is also something like a social crisis, a human crisis. And so we have been all going through it and we have all to deal with it. Coming on to the virus itself, it is known as the coronavirus disease 2019. Initially, it was known as the 2019 novel coronavirus. It is a severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, and it has some genetic similarity to the SARS-CoV-1, which caused an outbreak in 2002, and the Middle East respiratory syndrome, which was again in 2012. However, this is quite different from these two outbreaks because those outbreaks involved around 2,000 to 8,000 of people. But this is really a pandemic. It is an epidemic that has spread over 206 countries and territories, and we are still counting. It has been, as we all know, first reported by officials in the Wuhan city in China in December 2019. And since then, it has spread all over the world. On January 30th, 2020, the WHO Director General declared it a public health emergency of international concern. So what is this virus? It is basically a single-stranded RNA virus with a genome size of 30 kb. The RNA viruses are known to have a very high mutation rate. And with this, the virus evolves and escapes the host immunity and develops drug resistance. It usually causes respiratory tract infections, which can be mild to lethal, but it also causes systemic involvement. Coming on to the structure, basically it has 4 structural proteins, and we need to know them because we will talk about the pathogenesis of the disease. You have the spike protein, which is one of the most important proteins, the membrane proteins, the nucleocapsid proteins, and the envelope proteins. And this is the single-stranded RNA, which is encased by the nucleocapsid. So coming on to the epidemiology, the disease is a new one. It has never happened in this world before. So whatever evidences, whatever management, whatever we are doing is as a response to this viral disease is basically whatever we have learned over the years in the past decades of the other outbreaks of these viral diseases. So the source of COVID-19 is that initially there was a loss in Chinese medicine, and this is what has been published recently in Nature. The mode of transmission of COVID-19 is primarily through droplets, and when the direct contact with these droplets from a person who has respiratory symptoms like coughing or sneezing can occur. It can also occur through surfaces surfaces which have these droplets on them, and so therefore it is very important to be washing your hands every 20 seconds, especially after being in public spaces. And avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth because through the mucous membranes, the virus enters our body. And also cleaning and disinfecting frequently touched surfaces daily. And keeping, of course, the social distancing norms. The other mode of transmission is thought to be the airborne transmission. Airborne transmission is through particles which are smaller in size and they remain in air for longer periods of time and can be transmitted to others over distances which are greater than 1 meter. There is some evidence that it is passed in urine and feces, but the transmission through a fecal-oral route is still debatable. How do we compare it with the seasonal flu, the common influenza that we have been seeing over the years, commonly in the US, which causes some mortality? As we compare it to the earlier influenza, that is the US seasonal influenza, that had a mortality of about 0.1% as compared to COVID-19, which is a mortality for all ages as high as 2.3%. So definitely this is a disease which has caused a lot of havoc and mortality. So this is something which is a global data from all over the world, and we see that it has affected more commonly the European and the American countries, that is the West, and relatively less commonly in Southeast Asia. As for 10th of May, there are around 40 lakh confirmed cases and around 3 lakh deaths, which have been reported by the WHO. Coming on to India, we compare the Indian data for the world data. It has definitely been better in India. We have presently about 60,000 cases, out of which around 20,000 cases have been cured. So therefore, the recovery rate is 1/3, is about 32%. And the number of deaths are about 2,000 over this period. The infection rate of COVID, when we look at it, the world is 2.2. That is the R0. That is the number of persons which are infected from one infected person is 2.2 for the world. And for India, it has been calculated to be around 1.7, and this is a good sign. The case doubling rate as for today has been reported to be 12 days, and the case fatality rate when we compare it to the rest of the world is 3.3% as compared to a variable case fatality rate somewhere from 2.3% to as high as 7% in other countries. When we look as in India as in regional sequences, we see that there are 2 states which are most involved, that is Maharashtra and Gujarat. And therefore the government of India has divided the Indian states into zones. These are districts which have been labeled as red, orange, and green according to the doubling rate and also according to the number of active cases which have been seen. So a red zone is a hotspot because it has a doubling rate of less than 4 days and it has more number of active cases. An orange zone is known when there are fewer cases as compared to the red zone, but no cases in the last 14 days. And green zone is something which has confirmed cases, which doesn't have confirmed cases, but new cases in the last 3 to 4 weeks. What we have seen that India has done better, but is there any role of isolation of quarantine? These are two terms which are commonly used. Isolation is used for someone who is already infected. He may or may not be symptomatic, and he may have a mild disease. And quarantine is something which is used for as a term for people who have contacts who are positive with COVID-19. So does it have any role in bringing down the slope? Yes, of course it has. Because if we see if there is no isolation, the curve rises steep. The rise of this curve is very steep. Whereas when there is at 99% isolation, you see that the curve is completely flattened. And this is the basis of all the social distancing and the lockdowns that we have been experiencing for the past 1.5 months. Looking at the incubation period, when we look at the SARS-CoV coronavirus 2, it usually has a incubation period varying from 3 to 7 days with an average of 5.2 days, and the range varies from 2 to 14 days. And so this is what is important, because asymptomatic patients can also keep on shedding the virus. And so for the current period of active monitoring, the WHO has recommended a quarantine of 14 days. Why is it different in India? One, maybe because of the environmental factors. There may be a lot of those factors which may be playing their role, but there are something which are known as the viral factors which are also important. Maybe the virus that we have in India may have a different virulence as compared to that we see in other parts of the world. When we look at the sequencing of the different proteins in different regions of the world, we see that the non-structural proteins are quite different in different parts of the world. And as compared to Europe and North America, the ones which are seen in Asia are quite different. So there may be some virulent factors which are important for the differences in frequency in different geographic areas. Coming on to the clinical presentation, the fever is one of the most common presentation, with around 90% of patients experiencing it. And this is the basis of monitoring of fever at all points. Wherever you see there is a lot of gathering, or people are checked for fever whenever they come to the hospital. The other important sign is the dry cough, which is seen around 70% of patients, fatigue in around 40%, and productive cough in about 1/3 of the patients, with shortness of breath seen in around 20% of the severely infected patients. So we can divide the course of the COVID-19 infection as a viral stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Stage 1 is which is asymptomatic, stage 2 is the non-severe symptomatic, and stage 3 is the severe respiratory inflammatory disease. The good news is that most of the patients have a mild to moderate disease. That is 80% of the patients just have mild to moderate disease. Critical of the severe disease is seen in about 20% of patients. Of course, there are definite criteria. How do you define mild, moderate, severe, and critical disease? According to the degree of involvement, the amount of lung involvement, the amount of hypoxemia, and the development of acute respiratory distress syndrome and shock. What are the different factors which play a role in the death in COVID-19? That is, we are looking at a susceptible population. So as we know, which is in news, that more the age of the patient, the more are the chances, more is the risk of death. Similarly, if there are pre-existing conditions, then these patients have more risk of death, as high as 10.5% in patients who have an already cardiovascular disease or diabetes or a chronic respiratory illness with compromised lung function. What are the causes of death? Basically, it is a multi-organ failure, respiratory failure, shock, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Now I'd like to come upon the pathophysiology of COVID-19. What is the pathophysiology when the virus enters our body, and how does it cause disease? This is a pictorial diagram to show how the virus infects the pneumocytes of the lung alveoli. This is a virus where you can see these spike proteins, that is the S known as the spike S protein. And these are the receptors which are present on the type 2 pneumocytes. These receptors are also present on the ciliated cells of the airways. And they're also seen in other organs like the heart, the kidney, and small intestine. So basically, the spike protein combines with the ACE inhibitors, that is the angiotensin convertase enzyme 2 receptor. And this is the receptor which plays an important part in activating the spike proteins. This is known as the transmembrane proteinase, that is the serine protease, which acts to divide the spike protein into S1 and S2 domains. The S1 binds with the receptor and the S2 leads to the formation of the membrane fusion. This fusion with the plasma membrane or with the organelles leads to endocytosis of the virus, which then releases the single-stranded RNA molecule, and this is then translated into a non-long polypeptides by using the host ribosomes. Once these polypeptides are formed, it leads to the formation of non-structural proteins of the virus, and then the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase, which is present in the viral genome, leads to the formation of the structural proteins and the ribosome and the RNA molecule. Once these are generated, they are assembled, and then the virus particle leaves the host body and then infects the other cells. And therefore, it damages the type 2 pneumocytes. So once it has entered the body, it leads to the release of the viruses. And in this way, it leads to the activation of a number of inflammatory cells, the macrophages, the dendritic cells. With the release of cytokines, it also activates the T cells, the CD4 positive and the CD8 positive T cells and the B cells, leading to a lot many cytokines which are released, especially interleukin 1, interleukin 6, and the tumor necrosis factor alpha. It has been seen that these patients have high plasma levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and the patients who land up in the intensive care units have a cytokine storm, that they have a higher level of granulocyte colony stimulating factors, other cytokines and tumor necrosis factors. And these patients also, the patients with severe disease also have low counts of CD4 and CD8 T cells, because these are hyperactivated, and lymphopenia has now been shown to be a critical factor accounting for the severity and mortality of these patients. So as I said earlier, basically it causes a respiratory disorder, which is the most common, rhinorrhea, sneezing and sore throat. It can lead to pneumonia, and on X-rays and CT scan, it shows up as ground glass opacities. It can lead to RNA anemia. That is, you can detect the virus in the circulation by the presence of its RNA material, and it can lead to acute respiratory distress syndrome. Among the systemic disorders, the systemic presentations, the patients can have fever, cough, fatigue, hemoptysis. They can lead to a cardiac injury, hypoxemia, dyspnea, lymphopenia, and when it involves the intestine, it can lead to diarrhea. What is more important is when there is a severe disease, it leads to a lot of cytokine release. It activates a lot of monocytes and other inflammatory cells, leads to the formation of these hyaline membrane, and therefore the gaseous exchange through these membrane to the alveolar surface is not possible. It leads to a lot of alveolar edema and hypoxemia, which is responsible for the acute condition and the critical stage of the disease. Coming on to the evidence which has generated over time with autopsy studies, we see that when you see the autopsy of these critical patients who die of the disease, there is a lot of hyaline membrane formation with a lot of exudation of inflammatory cells. This is a cytokeratin stain to show the hyaline membrane, which is formed of all the cellular elements and cellular debris, the epithelial cells. And also there may be some amount of squamous metaplasia. What is more important is these also show a lot of RBC aggregation and thrombosis of the vessels, leading on to pulmonary embolism. And this may be one of the critical factors leading into death of these patients. There is evidence which is coming in from involvement of the other organs itself. We may think that the kidney injury may be because of the amount of alveolar edema it causes, the hypovolemia and the hypotension leading to shock-like state, an acute tubular injury. But not only there is this acute tubular injury and RBC aggregates in the peritubular capillaries, but electron microscopy has shown that there are virus particles in the tubules and the podocytes. So there is an evidence of the coronavirus nuclear protein in the tubules. So there is an evidence of direct parenchymal infection of the tubular epithelial cells and the podocytes with marked acute tubular injury and erythrocyte aggregation, which occurs in severe lethal COVID-19. So this may be the reason that because the angiotensin convertase enzyme receptors are present in different organs. So this may not be just a pulmonary manifestation. You may have multiple organs which are directly infected by the virus, which may lead to the shock-like condition, the critical state of the patient. So, so we see that this disease can have a multi-organ involvement. It can have a lot of the morphology and the presentation can be varied. It can just be a pulmonary disease, it can be a mild disease, and it can of course be a very critical disease with multi-organ system failure. So what is the current treatment and recommendations of the WHO? So we know that there is no definite management which is available for COVID-19 presently, and the WHO has recommended, the current evidence shows that there is no treatment, and therefore whatever treatment we have is all supportive. The role of supportive care is basically based on the severity of illness. The symptomatic treatment is for the mild disease, and evidence-based ventilatory management is for acute respiratory distress syndrome. The early recognition and treatment of bacterial infections, I think this is the most important factor, and sepsis in critically ill patients is very, very important, so that you can save these patients according to the severity of illness. The other recommendations of the WHO are that not to give routinely systemic steroids for the treatment of viral pneumonia outside clinical trial. There has been a common practice of giving corticosteroids in severe inflammatory conditions. So this is one thing which has to be avoided. There are investigational anti-COVID therapies which are there in the market, and you hear of a new drug every day. So they should be used only in approved randomized controlled trials. Presently, there are more than 200 clinical trials which are going on for anti-COVID-19 related therapies. Coming on to this figure again, when we try to look at the different therapies, we will come to know that there are different therapies which target different stages of the pathogenesis of the virus. One of the most common talked about is the chloroquine and the hydroxychloroquine treatment, which is presently being recommended by the ICMR to be given for healthcare workers for prophylaxis. Inhibits viral entry into the cell and endocytosis by multiple mechanisms, basically by the membrane fusion, and it blocks the membrane fusion and endocytosis. But with its experience with the autoimmune diseases, we also know that it has a lot of post-immunomodulatory effects, and therefore it can be used. Chloroquine has a high cardiac toxicity. It has other toxicities also like retinopathies, and hydroxychloroquine is a relatively safer drug. But presently the evidence which is there for chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine is not very robust for its use. The other drugs which can be used to inhibit the transmembrane proteases, and which also target the spike proteins. The other drug which is very talked about these days is the remdesivir, or the other antiviral drugs like ribavirin and the favipiravir, which act on the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase of the virus particle, and therefore blocks its replication, and it is being used in clinical trials as a therapeutic target in these patients, especially in the mild to moderate disease where early intervention may help in the viral spread of the disease. Other drugs which can act are the lopinavir and darunavir, which act on the proteases. The other which is most talked about is the tocilizumab and the sarilumab. Basically, these prevent the cytokine storm by binding to the interleukin-6 receptor. It prevents the interleukin-6 receptor activation, and therefore it inhibits the interleukin-6 signaling, and therefore it may prevent the severe disease, and it is especially useful to avoid the cytokine storm which leads to the critically ill patients. We have other options like the convalescent plasma. What is this convalescent plasma which is being used for plasma therapy? It is basically the immunoglobulin antibodies in the plasma of these patients who have been recovering or who have recovered from these viral infection. And this, when you have these antibodies, they may help in suppressing viremia in patients who have active infection, who are infected with the disease. In plasma therapy, also robust data is yet to come, but there are a lot of clinical trials which are going on to suggest that plasma therapy may be one of the way out to in these patients. Of course, we have a large number of herbal medications which are being recommended. Basically, these herbal medications act as immunity boosters. And if your immunity is strong enough, as is being said that Indians have a good immunity, it may resist the entry of the virus and further leading on to the severe critically disease in these patients. What about a vaccine? The only two ways in developing a resistance to this disease is the development of a herd immunity and if you have a successful vaccine. There are more than 30 vaccine trials which are going on, but this is the one which is being talked about and which has been most successful. That is being developed by the University of Oxford in UK. Dr. Sarah Gilbert, who is a professor of vaccinology at the university, is presently doing a clinical trial. Basically, it is a randomized controlled trial in which half of the patients, which will be around, they will be enrolling about 800 to 1,000 participants. Half of them will receive the COVID-19 vaccine, and half will act as a control group who will also receive a vaccine, but this vaccine which will be against meningitis, but not against the coronavirus. And then they will see the results of this vaccine in these patients. Of course, there is of apprehension in the community that if there is a steep in the steep downfall of the curve of the coronavirus in UK, then the amount of results that the outcome of these vaccine may not be very evident in the population. Because of course, the time will tell how these vaccines will act. But as for now, we know that it will not be before 1 year to 18 months before we have a good vaccine which will act against the coronavirus. And maybe we will have to learn to live with the disease. Coming on to how this vaccine works, basically what they have done is they have taken the genes from the spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus and they have put them into a harmless virus to make a vaccine. So this is basically a weakened virus which is then injected into the patient, and this virus, when injected into the patient, it enters the cells and starts to produce a coronavirus spike proteins. Once this weakened spike protein is produced, the body will have a reaction to this and then the immune system will produce antibodies and it will activate the killer T cells to destroy the infected cells. And therefore, when the patient has a coronavirus infection again, these antibodies and the activated T cells are triggered to fight the virus. And this is how this vaccine will act in these patients. So coming on to the end of the seminar, I would like to say that we are facing a global health crisis. And as WHO Director General Dr. Tedros has said, we have been able to control smallpox by our attempts. So if the scientific community comes together and all the continents of the world are there standing together, we will be able to beat this disease and see an end to it. But of course, the end is yet to, it will be later to come. So are there any questions? हेलो
हेलो जी मैम, एक जस्ट मिनट, मैं डॉक्टर पांडे को अनम्यूट करते हैं एक सेकंड. Can we unmute everyone or should actually Dr. Pandey?
I'm muting myself.
Oh, okay, please.
So if I have the question.
Yes.
Dr. Pandey, please.
Yeah.
आपको unmute है वीडियो.
हाँ, yes, thank you. Well, thank you so much, ma'am, for a wonderful presentation. We have tremendous response from our audience. We have learned the questions I would like to pose. Like a question is there, like which protein is responsible for cleaving spike protein? I think it was there in the presentation. Which protein is responsible for cleaving the spike protein?
Yeah, so the surface.
Shall I repeat again?
No, I've heard the question. I was muted, so I've unmuted it. So
Okay.
there are two receptors basically on the surface of the alveolar cell, that is the type 2 pneumocytes, which produce surfactant. So these are basically, they are the two receptors are the ACE2 receptors, as I talked about, and there is another receptor that is known as the transmembrane serine proteases, which basically prime the virus. They prime the virus and break the spike proteins into two components. That is the S1 domain and the S2 domain. So basically, this is the protein which is responsible. And of course, there are a lot of drugs which are there in the clinical trials where they say that if you block this part of it, the virus spike proteins may not be activated and it may be responsible for blocking the disease. But of course, evidence is yet to come.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just one more query. Like, what could be the reason for structural difference?
Can you come again? Can you repeat?
Structural differences of virus in different countries. What could be the reasons for structural differences in different countries of the virus?
Of the virus. Okay. Okay, that's a really nice question. So the structural differences, as I showed, there are a lot of structural differences between different regions of the world. And it is known that these RNA viruses keep mutating according to the different environments in which they are there. So it has been seen that in the same country, you may have different variations of the same virus. So for example, if the virus has been there, which has come from a different country, for example, in India, if it has come from somewhere from Europe, or it has come from the US, or it has come from Australia, it may have different variations. So the variations are basically related to the different environmental conditions and the different host factors also, because the virus, the RNA virus, is known to have a lot of mutations in it. So the number of variations that have been seen is more than 200 in different, basically in the non-structural proteins that are there. We talked about the structural proteins that we see on the virals, but there are many non-structural proteins that they are there. And therefore it has been seen that these are the mutation areas which are more common in different. And of course, there are studies which show that in different regions, you have different type of variations that are seen. There are differences in these structural proteins. As I showed in the bar graph, that the structural protein differences and variations occurs, and therefore it has been used, especially there are trials in severely ill patients where they say that these ACE2 inhibitors can be used as a therapy in these patients. But yes, the evidence, the amount of evidence that we have is limited. In fact, there were a lot of studies which said that these patients who are already on ACE2 inhibitors because of the hypertension and other comorbidities, ACE2 inhibitors should not be given. But there is a lot of controversy regarding this, and now WHO has come up with a statement saying that ACE2 inhibitors, stoppage of ACE2 inhibitors in these patients is not recommended. It may or may not be done according to the patient's condition, and it cannot be done as a general statement in these patients. So of course, the evidence is limited, but there are studies which are talking about avoiding ACE2 inhibitors, and there are also studies which say that you can use ACE2 inhibitors as a therapy in these patients like losartan, and it may decrease the severity of the disease.
Okay. Then is there any evidence-based study which can say that Ayush recommendations are boosting immunity against the virus?
So there are a lot of agents, I should say, which are there in the market. Of course, we see a lot of recommendations that you can use that and these. of course, the scientific evidence is not there.
Okay.
But yes, in the lack of scientific evidence, we also know that these may not cause any harm. So like recommendations that tulsi leaves may be useful, recommendations that haldi may be useful. So we know that these Ayush preparations, as for now, there are no recommendations that yes, they are useful. But yes,
Okay.
looking at it, there are no harms attached to it. So people may use them.
Okay.
Yes, of course, with no scientific evidence. That is as for now. As for now.
Okay. Okay.
And basically, people are saying that India has shown recovery much more faster and less number of cases. Maybe these are factors which are there in our system, in our fooding, which are responsible. So you never know. We come up with evidence later on, but as for now, no scientific evidence.
Okay. Is there any chance of using protease inhibitors to prevent proliferation of viral load?
Yeah. So as I showed in that diagram, yes, they are using protease inhibitors, and there are a lot of, in fact, there are a lot of protease inhibitors which are in market, which basically avoid the formation of that polypeptides by the viruses, which using the ribosomes of the host. So there are proteases which digest and then don't let the non-structural proteins be there, so that the virus genome cannot have an assembly. Yes, they can be used, and there are different clinical trials also which are going in. But yes, I think it is too early to say anything, because the evidence will come with time on these clinical trials, and maybe after a span about 3 months to 4 months and 6 months, when we have adequate data, we'll be able to comment on it.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. We had a wonderful session. I hope our audiences are benefited out of your information, and hope to continue